friends, brave farers through the rain, for joining us. Feel free to move forward as you like. So we'll have a question and answer session after our presentation. My name is Lena Blunt. I'm the Communications and Outreach Coordinator here at Pendle Hill. So welcome, familiar faces, new faces, and welcome, of course, to our guest tonight, Sarah Azaransky. Sarah has actually been at Pendle Hill several times over the last 5 years or so, working on this wonderful book we get to hear about tonight, This Worldwide Struggle. She's a graduate of Swarthmore College, Harvard Divinity School, and the University of Virginia. Sarah now teaches courses in social ethics about race and sexualities and their intersections at Union Theological Seminary. Sarah is also the author of The Dream is Freedom, Pauli Murray and the American Democratic Faith, and editor of Religion and Politics in America's Borderlands. Currently, she's researching public school desegregation campaigns in New York City. And before I speak a little bit further and welcoming Sarah, I just want to provide the commercial interlude for what is also happening here at Pendle Hill for those of you who might be interested in some of our upcoming programs. This speaker series is a regular monthly event. We call them our Monday night lectures. They're free and open to the public, both in person and live streamed on our website. You can register and then view the speeches later on our YouTube channel, which is Pendle Hill USA. So even with the rain, we have about 30 to 40 folks watching live streaming at home. So that's just putting that out there as an option should you not be able to be with us every Monday of first Monday of the month. Our next first Monday will be Labor Day, September 4th. We'll be welcoming Christina Repoli, who is the director of Quaker Voluntary Service. She'll be speaking about Quaker Voluntary Service's work and their vision for their future moving forward. So welcome everyone to return September 4th at 7:30 for that event. In addition, I'd like to share some brief information about our next Pendle Hill Conference, Social Justice Through Economic Resistance. That conference is September 21st through 24th. And is really seeking to answer some of the queries and questions that rose out of a program here at Pendle Hill last year about visioning and creating a moral economy. That program brought together really amazing thinkers, political scientists, and organizers looking at solidarity economies, co-ops, and how to address some of these issues of economic inequality that are certainly deep-seated in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Coming out of that program in 2016 was a lingering question of, well, how do we transition from where we are to where we want to go? And this September conference, Social Justice Through Economic Resistance, attempts to carry that conversation forward and answer some of those questions. Thank you for indulging the commercials. And again, I'm so thrilled to welcome Sarah back to Pendle Hill and to join us tonight to speak more about her book, This Worldwide Struggle. Of the book, Tracy C. West, professor of Christian ethics and African American studies at Drew University, says, Azaransky offers a savvy, cogently written understanding of the internationalism of early 20th century Black Christian intellectuals and activists. She comprehensively details previously neglected history of African American religious contributions to global moral commitments, challenging white supremacy and socioeconomic inequalities. This book is an inspiring primer in deliberately crafted frontiers of justice-oriented Black Christianity, so timely for anyone seeking hopeful roadmaps for similar contemporary forms of religious solidarity supporting human dignity across borders. So, without further ado, welcome Sarah.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is such a delight. I mean, I'm here all the time, so I shouldn't say it's such a delight to be here. It is always. it's strange and wonderful to be here in this context, because this book that I can physically now hold emerged in large part because of Pendle Hill. Pendle Hill's in the acknowledgments. I thank everyone, especially the cooks, for their efforts, honestly, in making this book possible. But also Pendle Hill's part of the book because it's in the book, because this network, this generation of especially African-American Christian activists and intellectuals, they were here, and they came here for generations. So when Lena talks about these programs that are happening right now, this week, next month, that are so important, that are critical in this political moment, there have been generations of this at Pendle Hill. That's what Pendle Hill has always been and needs to continue to be. So that's why it's especially exciting to be here talking about where people retreated to in 1950 when they needed help, and it was here. So this is a very, very special place, special to me also. Okay, so I am delighted to talk with you today about this new book that's about religion and the international roots of the civil rights movement. So as Lena mentioned, I first visited Pendle Hill about 5 years ago to do research at Swarthmore and then later at AFSC. And then a number of the people who were in the book, Bayard Rustin, who's a main character, he's on the cover of the book, was here often. Howard Thurmond, who I'll talk about a little bit later, he was here often. And William Stewart Nelson, who is less known, but he and his wife came here before they went to India to spend a year in 1947 with the American Friends Service Committee. And they needed to come here to learn about Quakerism, because he was the dean of the School of Religion at Howard, but he was a Baptist minister. So this is where you come to learn about Quakerism and to learn how to deal with the folks at the AFSC. Well, you can read about it. So in what I'll talk about today, I'll focus on three things. I'll give a frame for the larger issues that the book addresses. Then I'll look at I'll give a frame of the larger historical issues. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about a disciplinary question about what it means when we talk about religion, and then I'll look at an example from the first chapter. And I hope there'll be lots of time for Q&A, and I hope we can talk about lots of other things then as well. Okay, so this book is about a network of Black American Christian intellectuals and activists who looked abroad, even in other religious traditions, for ideas and practices that could transform American democracy. So I focus on a particular time period from the 1930s to the 1950s when this group drew lessons from independence movements around the world for an American racial justice campaign. So these Black Christian intellectuals developed religious perspectives and methods of moral reasoning that became theological blueprints for the later civil rights movement. The group included professors and public intellectuals like Howard Thurmond and Benjamin Mays and William Stewart Nelson. They included ecumenical movement leaders, notably YWCA women like Juliet Derricotte, Sue Bailey Thurmond, and Celestine Smith. And the network included innovators of Black Christian nonviolence like James Farmer, Polly Murray, and Bayard Rustin. Everyone in this group would become mentors to, advisors to, or co-workers with King, and 3 people in the group met with Gandhi, Thurmond, Mays, and Nelson. So they become the living links between Gandhi, who was killed in 1948, and King, who becomes a national figure in 1956. Today, I'll hit on 3 aspects of this history. I'll identify a Christian Black internationalism. Next, I'll address really quickly a debate within religious studies about just what religion is. And then I'll look at one of these exchanges and some of the resulting religious and political reflection. So first, to a Black Christian internationalism. The Christian activists and intellectuals that I write about were part of an international turn in Black political thought that happened after the 1920s. Black internationalism, that category, describes comparisons between racism in the United States and racism and imperial oppression in other parts of the world. And increasingly in the 1920s, Black Americans were recognizing that though they were a numerical minority in the United States, they were part of a global majority of peoples of color. And they started to understand themselves then as part of this larger movement against white supremacy that included the struggles of Blacks and Indians in South Africa, Hindus and Muslims in India, and Aboriginal peoples in Australia, among many others. Now, Black internationalism, this category, it is wide and deep. We tend to look at it as particularly in the 1920s, which I'll talk about in a second. But we can look back to the 1800s to Martin Delany and Alexander Crummell, and into the 20th century, Stokely Carmichael, who becomes Kwame Ture, Malcolm X, of course, and Assata Shakur, who still lives in exile in Cuba. So Black internationalism is a big category. And the period between especially World War I and World War II was a high point of Black internationalism. And historians often cite W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey as kind of paradigmatic figures. So those are the two options of what Black internationalism can look like. So Du Bois led a series of Pan-African conferences between 1919 and 1945 that stoked an international conversation of Black politics and strategy among Black people throughout the diaspora, many of whom would become leaders in anti-colonial movements in the Caribbean and in sub-Saharan Africa. And Du Bois edited The Crisis, the NAACP journal whose international focus came to exemplify the rest of the mid-century Black press. Du Bois first published Gandhi, I think, in 1920. So they were in touch and in contact. Too often we neglect how Du Bois gave geographic specificity to the dilemma of the last century. We may all know this truism, but we don't know the end of the sentence. In 1903, Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." That's the middle of the sentence. He continues, "The relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea." So for Du Bois, the problem of the color line was always an international one. So here we have Du Bois as one example of what Black internationalism looks like. Another is Marcus Garvey, who during this period moved the headquarters of the United Negro Improvement Association from where he was from in Kingston, Jamaica, to Harlem, and he established 1,900 UNIA chapters in over 40 countries and colonies. That is a global movement. Now, Garvey rejected integration, the goal of the Du Bois-led Niagara movement, and proposed that Blacks throughout the diaspora return to Africa to found an African empire. Now, Du Bois and Garvey are often pitted as kind of opponents, and they were. They disagreed on almost everything except the most important thing, which is this notion of a Black international. So we should ask why they are pitted as opponents when the most important thing they agree on. Now, the network of Christian intellectuals that I'm talking about represents a third kind of Black internationalism, one rooted in Protestant missions. So before the Great Migration and the development of a self-consciously internationalist Black politics in the urban North, Black Christians throughout the country had been hearing, since the late 1700s, visiting missionary stories from abroad, especially from the Caribbean and West Africa, so they were developing their own sense of the international. An important element in this history comes especially after emancipation, when Black denominations begin to send in great numbers Black American missionaries to West Africa. And one of the things they do is start to establish American-style schools. One of the results of Black American missionaries in the 1800s setting up these basically high schools, the equivalent of, is that when you have West Africans in the early 20th century, when they have the choice, especially English-speaking West Africans, if they have the opportunity to do their schooling abroad, they're choosing to come to the United States and go to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, instead of going to England. So one example is, or two examples, but to the same school, are Kwame Nkrumah and Nnamdi Azikiwe, who studied nearby at Lincoln University, an HBCU, and later both of them at Howard in the 1920s and 30s. Nkrumah would become the first prime minister of a free Ghana, Azikiwe the first president of a free Nigeria. And both led independence movements that they described as nonviolent, Christian, and Gandhian. Bayard Rustin developed important relationships with Nkrumah and Azikiwe when Rustin visited West Africa in 1952 to glean lessons from their independence movements. Rustin, who I'm sure you all know, grew up nearby in Westchester, when he met Nkrumah and Azikiwe in what is now Ghana and what is now Nigeria, he talked college sports with both men because he followed Lincoln and he himself had been an exceptional athlete in high school. Later, Rustin was instrumental in getting King invited to Ghana's independence celebration, and in 1959, Rustin himself returned to Ghana to organize an international Pan-African pacifist protest of French nuclear testing in the Sahara, which is a very Rustinian thing to do. Now, I'm not going to talk much about Rustin in my prepared remarks. I'm so happy to talk about him in Q&A. As I say, he really became a central figure in the book. Bayard Rustin is probably best known as the organizer of the March on Washington, and then perhaps, if people will credit him this, and he was an important advisor to King, he and Ella Baker were the chief strategists of the movement, let's say, and he was an incredibly sophisticated thinker. And he was a religious thinker. And people have missed this, or most people have. They miss this because he was an activist. So people don't recognize the kind of thought that goes into being an activist and the thoughtful reflection. They also miss it because he was Quaker. Now, you all don't, but in other audiences, people have missed that. And in part, I think it's because so many of us trained in religious studies and theology, even when we are able to do the kind of analysis that's necessary on religious thinkers, they don't understand Rustin's religiosity. They don't see the categories as being religious categories. They don't understand why he's concerned about separation and what that might be. So all that's to say, reading so much of Rustin from the 40s, from his writing, especially in the 40s and the 50s, has convinced me that he's one of the most important religious thinkers of the 20th century. Okay, so end of the aside. So I was talking about this third kind of religious Black internationalism, a Christian Black internationalism that emerges from missionaries going to West Africa, and especially the school connection. There's a third important aspect of it, and that is the international Christian ecumenical movement, especially the YM and YWCA, which opened further international channels for Black Christians. So travel under the auspices of the Y in the early part of the 20th century to South Asia and West Africa and even to Europe enabled Black American Christians to meet and build alliances with Christians of color from around the world and to draw firsthand comparisons between colonialism and Jim Crow. So it's after these visits with these anti-colonial activists that they start to understand that what they're experiencing as Jim Crow is also a kind of colonialism. So upon their return from Asia or Africa, Y women and men spoke at churches, community centers, colleges, and public forums throughout the country and shared lessons from freedom campaigns in other parts of the world. Okay, so I'm about to give you a detailed example of what this looks like, of one particular Black American Christian theologian taking lessons from other parts of the world. And I do want to underscore that looking at religion and the international roots of the civil rights movement means not only rethinking the history of the movement, that we also should be attentive to the category of religion and to the history of that category. There is a wide-ranging debate about just what religion is. It's very inside baseball and arcane, and it can be painful, but it's important to what's going on here. So I will make it really short and not too arcane, I hope. And also, it can flow over you, and that's okay. Okay. So, 3 points. The first one, the category of religion is a product of Christian understandings and priorities, particularly priorities of white European and North American Christians. The field of religious studies started when a group of mostly Christian academics who, in developing the category of religion, so they're like, there's this thing and we want to be able to measure it. What is this thing? Well, they, in developing the category of religion, gave more weight to kinds and ways of belief and practices that they knew. So what came to count as religion looks awful lot like a particular kind of Christianity. That is, religion is theistic, it's concerned with doctrines, it often describes individual and privatized belief. So, if religion is a product of Christian understanding, then, as Talal Hassad has argued, there are dangers in employing the category of religion when analyzing non-Christian traditions. Okay. Second issue is a related issue is how religious studies, the academic discipline, and now we're getting like super inside baseball, grew up entangled with European colonialism. Religious studies is not alone in this. Anthropology, for those of you who know, has its own history to grapple with. For religious studies, what this has meant is, on the one hand, colonialism made available materials and religious artifacts to study, I mean, it's also what fills our libraries, what the Metropolitan Museum in New York is, right? It's a result of these sorts of relationships. And it's a beautiful museum, right? So it's incredibly problematic. But also religious studies, here's the as big of an issue, tended to endorse colonial projects by promoting misunderstandings of non-Western traditions. As one scholar of Sikhism has put it, religious studies has depicted non-Western traditions, quote, as static, frozen object, namely as phenomena to be known and studied by conceptually more advanced cultures. There's a particular history of this around Indian religions, around Christians studying Indian religions from India. Now, third point, we're almost to the end, the good news. Then this is the good news, that post-colonial and decolonial theologians and religious studies scholars are reimagining the field so that it doesn't other non-Western traditions. So Kwok Pui-Lan, who's a post-colonial feminist theologian from Hong Kong who works in the United States, she was recently president of our larger guild, the American Academy of Religion, and she has called for those of us who are scholars of religious studies to be consistently raising questions about power and knowledge, about the politics of representation, and about the construction of the West and the rest. Okay. Now, this is exciting to me because as this conversation is happening in our field, and it's been really going strong for the last 10, 20 years, this group of Black intellectuals Black Christian intellectuals, is a fascinating historical example of what Kwok and others want contemporary religious studies scholars to be. So beginning in the mid-1930s, this group was engaging thoughtfully with Indian religions and building relationships with Indian scholars and activists in the climactic years of the independence movement. And their identities challenge a clear distinction between the West and the rest. Yes, they were Western American Christians. They were also African-descended people who were subject to colonial conditions of Jim Crow. And as they were in the 1930s and 1940s developing sophisticated accounts of Black religion, Black American religion was often denigrated as underdeveloped and irrational, as ahistorical and emotional, the same way that religious studies has othered non-Western traditions. So that's to say this group is a really wonderful historical reference for what my contemporary colleagues are asking that we do today. Okay, so with my time left, I'll turn to one concrete example from this network of Black Christian intellectuals and activists, and it's Howard Thurman's visit to South Asia in 1935 and 1936. Howard Thurman, what can I say? He was a great 20th century American theologian and social critic. He had been marked as a theological prodigy early on, beginning in the mid-1920s, which were also his mid-20s. He kept a punishing schedule of giving talks about race relations all over the country. In part because of his renown, he was invited to lead a so-called Negro delegation on a pilgrimage of friendship to South Asia. It was to take place over 5 months, and it was sponsored by the International YM and YWCA. So here you see the role of the International Christian Ecumenical Movement. Thurman was thrilled by the chance to go to India. He had been following Gandhi's efforts in the Indian independence movement, and he and his colleagues at Howard School of Religion, he was a professor there of social ethics at the time, he was convinced that how the Indian independence movement was using religion and other moral sources could be a model for an American racial justice movement. So the delegation included 4 people: Howard Thurman, a Methodist minister and his wife, and Sue Bailey Thurman, who was Howard Thurman's wife and always his intellectual equal. She was a YWCA leader, she was a committed internationalist, and she's a public historian. So for those of you who have been to Boston and been to the African Meeting House or been on the African Freedom Trail, she did that. So that was her sort of vision and project. Okay. So this delegation from the end of 1935 through to 1936 went all over the subcontinent. So if you can have the map of South Asia in your mind, for 5 months, they traveled the length and breadth of what is now, so don't, because I'm going to be opposite, right? Sri Lanka, Burma, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, which is a lot to do now. It was certainly a lot to do in 1935 and 1936. Throughout, Thurman lectured about politics, history, and religion in the United States, and he was often met with very specific questions. Man, his international audience knew the American scene. So like he was getting questions about the Scottsboro case, which in 1935 appeals were still making their way through the federal courts. So his audience knew. Near the end of the trip, Thurmond met with Gandhi. Thurmond was well prepared for the meeting and eager to ask Gandhi about tactics that African Americans could use in a racial justice movement here. But Gandhi had his own pressing questions. Wait, before you ask anything, Gandhi said, first tell me, why are you a Christian? When Christianity is associated with segregation in the United States and colonialism here, Gandhi asked, why aren't you a Muslim instead? Because in Islam, there is no color line. Now, there's a lot more to that exchange. I'll say a little bit more in a second, but this question of why Thurmond was a Christian struck him, in part because this was not the first time Thurmond had been asked. In fact, he was asked throughout the trip a number of different times. The exchange that had the greatest effect on him came early in the trip when he was giving a lecture in Colombo, what is now Sri Lanka, at the law school. He wrote about this exchange a number of times in different places, so he clearly was reckoning with it. I'll read to you from his account in Jesus and the Disinherited, which is maybe Thurmond's most well-known book. So near the beginning of the book, he's talking about, he's giving this lecture. Okay, so I'm reading from Thurmond recounting this. Thurmond writes, at the close of a talk before the Law College, University of Colombo, on civil disabilities under states' rights in the United States, I was invited by the principal to have coffee. We drank our coffee in silence. After the service had been removed, he said to me, so now Thurmond's going to quote the law principal, the dean of the law school. He's quoting the dean. What are you doing over here? I know what the newspapers say about a pilgrimage of friendship and the rest, but that is not my question. What are you doing over here? This is what I mean. More than 300 years ago, your forefathers were taken from the western coast of Africa as slaves. Since emancipation, you have lived in a Christian nation in which you are segregated, lynched, and burned. Even in the church, I understand, there is segregation. One of my students who went to your country sent me a clipping, a newspaper article, telling about a Christian church in which the regular Sunday worship was interrupted so that many could join a mob against one of your fellows. When he had been caught and done to death, they came back to resume their worship of their Christian God. I am a Hindu. I do not understand. Here you are in my country, standing deep within the Christian faith and tradition. I do not wish to seem rude to you, but sir, I think you are a traitor to all the darker peoples of the earth. I am wondering what you, an intelligent man, can say in defense of your position. The next sentence, our subsequent conversation lasted for more than 5 hours. Yes. So this book set out to answer the law professor's probing question. How can Thurmond call himself a Christian and not be a traitor? To answer, and why I love teaching this book, to answer, Thurmond did what any good theologian should do. He started by rereading the Gospels. And when he did, Thurmond saw what he always knew, but he saw it in a new way. And that is, Jesus was a poor Jew who lived in Palestine under Roman occupation without citizenship status. Thurmond used the Christian story to analyze what was to him the contemporary American political situation. In texts about the first century, Thurmond perceived an existential and political crisis similar to what Black Americans experienced during Jim Crow. Thurmond wrote, quote, the striking similarity between the social position of Jesus in Palestine and that of the vast majority of American Negroes is obvious to anyone who tarries long over the facts. Thurmond's radical message was that Jesus had suffered indignities similar to those endured by Black Americans. Instead of justifying oppressive racial politics, the Bible offers strategies to resist imperialism, racism, and injustice. By lifting up Jesus' resistance against Roman occupation, Thurmond showed how the religion of Jesus, and he increasingly began to distinguish the religion of Jesus from Christianity, the institutionalized, what was connected to segregation and colonialism, but the religion of Jesus could provide techniques for confronting Jim Crow. And Thurmond prioritized concrete, practical action. Repeatedly, he emphasized that the Gospels depict people not merely changing their heart, but taking action. He wrote, quote, "There cannot be too great an insistence on the point we are here dealing with a discipline, a method, a technique," he's a social ethicist, "as over against some form of wishful thinking or simple desiring." Jesus and the Disinherited, this book was a theological argument about the meaning of Jesus for the rejected and the oppressed, for those whose backs are against the wall, as he says on the first page. But it was also a proposal for interracial communication. The book developed a moral framework for relationship between Black and white Americans and considered the standards of just community. The book also had Gandhian lessons, that is, lessons from Gandhi's activism in India. Now, the book refers to Gandhi by name only once. I've read it like 8 times, I think, only once that I've found. And Thurmond quotes a letter that Gandhi writes to an activist about why it's important to tell the truth. Okay, yes. But more than this singular reference, the book contained Gandhi's teaching in an elemental, if perhaps less obvious way, which is a very Thurmond thing to do. And that is, the book has Gandhian bones. Now, you can't see this, but trust me, this is the table of contents. And the table of contents reflected Gandhi's program. The middle chapters are fear, deception, and hate. And these are the antitheses of what Gandhi described as the cardinal principles of nonviolence: fearlessness, truth, and love. Thurmond's final chapter is love. But again, not about feeling, about careful critical action. So Thurmond employed Gandhi's terms in Thurmond's own theological construction to demonstrate in the first 3 instances what Jesus overcame, and then in the last instance what Jesus does. So in other words, Thurmond's signal contribution to Christian theology relied on a Gandhian outlook that drew on Hinduism among other moral traditions. Now, I keep holding this book up because there's a significance to its size. This little book grew in importance when it became a primary text of the later movement. People who traveled with King said that he took 2 books with him almost everywhere. One was, of course, the Bible, and the other was Jesus and the Disinherited. So King took with him this book that, and of course, King knew the Thurmonds. He spent a lot of time with them when he was at BU, and Thurmond was the dean of the Marsh Chapel, but also Thurmond had gone to school with Daddy King, and so the families have knew each other for years. And King Jr. and Thurmond watched baseball games together on the weekend when they lived in Boston. So King carried with him this book that emerged in part out of international travel and a very direct challenge that Thurmond see his religious tradition in a new light. In it, Thurmond outlined fearlessness, reverence for personality, and how to free white people from what he called our white necessity, his wonderful category, that became mainstays of King's activism and of King's great intellectual contributions to democratic theory and to Christian theology. Now, it's worth noting again that key for Thurmond's theological innovation was this challenge for him to see himself in a new light, for him to give an account of why he was not a traitor. You can easily imagine when someone's accusing you of something like that to say, no, but that's not true. And he didn't. This is a crucial ethical moment. Now, there's an important flip side to this, and that is Thurmond, just as he took seriously hard questions directed at him, he never shied away from asking difficult questions of others. And he was able to learn from people whose moral visions were limited. And this is a crucial skill, I think, as we now are looking for moral and intellectual resources to help us face contemporary crises. Now, Gandhi is an example of someone with a limited moral vision. So lately, especially in the last 10 years or so, it's made its way to the United States, there has been important reevaluation of Gandhi's work, prompted by questions like, why did Gandhi exclude Black South Africans from his movement there? Could Gandhi reconcile his service in the Boer War with his later anti-imperialism? Why did Gandhi oppose so-called untouchability but not caste? These questions suggest that Gandhi's program was not as nonviolent as he insisted it was. Well, in 1936, Howard Thurman and Benjamin Mays asked these exact questions to Gandhi himself. Thurmond and Mays were good friends and colleagues at Howard School of Religion. Mays was then dean of the school. In 1940, he would leave to go to Morehouse. Mays wrote landmark texts in Black church studies and Black theology, and he's best known as the mentor to Martin Luther King, who called him one of the great influences in my life. Thurmond went to India first. He met with Gandhi in March of 1936. Mays went to India later that year to attend a YMCA conference and made arrangements to meet Gandhi. And he talked to him on New Year's Eve, actually, of 1936. Thurmond and Mays were well-read on Indian politics, Indian religions, and the history of Gandhi's organizing in India as well as in South Africa. So they were prepared to ask difficult questions. For example, Thurmond's first question to Gandhi, when he finally got a chance to ask, was, did Black South Africans play any part in your movement there? Thurmond was referring to the first phase in Gandhi's career when Gandhi organized against excessive taxing and British restrictions on free movement of Indians between South African states. Now, there's a lot more I could say, but in short, in South Africa, Gandhi's activism was largely limited to working in an expatriate Indian community of Hindus and Muslims who were in South Africa, as well as a few sympathetic white activists. At the turn of the century, it seemed clear that Gandhi thought that Indian South Africans could prove themselves worthy of British citizenship in a way that Black South Africans couldn't have. They didn't have the same capacity for citizenship as Indian South Africans did. So the simple answer to Thurmond's question about whether Gandhi and Black South Africans had worked together was no. And Thurmond knew that before he asked the question, because he knew the history. But he wanted to hear what Gandhi would say. Gandhi answered him, I purposely did not invite them, Black South Africans. It would have endangered their cause. They would not have understood the technique of our struggle, nor could they have seen the purpose or utility of nonviolence. And Thurmond would have also known that's not true, because Thurmond was good friends with Max Jurgen, who at the time, or right before this, had been a YMCA worker and been engaging with the early parts of what would become the ANC, the African National Congress, and they were very much engaged in nonviolence at that point. So, come on, Gandhi. So, Gandhi did not explain why Black South Africans would not have understood nonviolence, but for his part, Thurmond wanted to know more. So again, this fascinating moment when he says to Thurmond's face, they wouldn't have gotten it. And the they he's talking about look precisely like Thurmond himself. My students and I talk about this. When is the moment when it's okay to walk away? That was the moment. And Thurmond didn't. And he said, okay, well, Gandhi, how are we to train individuals and communities in this difficult art? What are we going to do in the United States? And Gandhi answered by describing in detail ahimsa, or non-injury, and also non-cooperation, and what they might look like in the context of Jim Crow. And of course, non-cooperation was first theorized on a mass level by James Farmer, who was a student at Howard, who would later become the leader of the Freedom Rides in 1961, but who in the late 30s was a student of Thurmond and Mays at Howard School of Religion and learned about this from him. So Thurmond wanted to ask, and got from Gandhi some really practical advice. And it's at the end of this meeting that Gandhi proclaimed, quote, it may be through Black Americans that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. So this is in 1936. So here we have Gandhi's benediction of the later American movement. And this exchange and so many others from this generation of intellectuals and activists shows, I think, importantly, the significance of critique and engagement to building effective social movements. The history also shows us how the greatest American social movement of the last century is also importantly international. And indeed, I think the international history of the civil rights movement affirms how democratic histories are always transnational. So that when the person who was elected most recently president of the United States, when he asked questions about whether Western values will survive, well, goodness, these are the wrong questions. Because history shows that democracy has profits in every region of the world, and that learning from many others has made this country more just and more free. And that it strikes me that these are the kind of lessons that we need today as we develop our own, as Thurmond would want us to do, disciplines and methods and techniques toward a more just social order. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Love to open question and answers to the audience and just ask that when you have your question for our listeners at home, hold the microphone right on your chin. That way they can hear you and it'll be picked up in the audio that's live streaming. And if you could please introduce yourself before you ask your question. And I'm happy to run the mic around the room. Don't raise your hands all at once.
Somebody has to do it. Start. I'm Maurice Eldridge, and I've been very interested in Gandhi, among other things, for a very, very long time. And when I learned about this kind of racist piece of him, I took a deep breath and said, well, we're all flawed. So Gandhi, who's been an idol of mine, my fellow human being, had to be flawed too. And so the opportunity to learn and to take paths that your own conditions impose on you would follow. But he's been really important, I think, in this. And I really appreciate your perspective on the international piece of this, because it touches on something that matters a lot to me, which in the contemporary world has to do with our failure to recognize one another around the world as one and the same. I even don't like to talk about race because I think of it as a social construct rather than a biological reality. And so I haven't read your book yet, and I'm really interested in it because I wonder what you're seeking to contribute to our growth in this needy arena.
Yeah. I'll say I'll answer in 2 or 3 ways, and then if you want a follow-up, of course. So I'll start by saying that, what do I hope this book contributes? I'll start backwards and to say that when I started, this book emerged out of my first book that was my dissertation that was about Pauli Murray, who is a ridiculously amazing figure, and she's everywhere. And in short, she's at the intersection of the civil rights and feminist movement in the 20th century, except she predated both, and she doesn't fit in any of the historiographies, and she's a wonderful mess. And she was at law school at Howard in the 40s. And in the 1940s, she was organizing sit-in campaigns of DC restaurants, which were women-led, which is sort of extraordinary, in part because men were fighting abroad, but also because she was who she is. And the administration, led by Mordecai Johnson, who was an avid devotee of Gandhi and his work, and absolutely, who was well known for his oratorical skills, he shut down these sit-ins. And I needed to write the 3 paragraphs in my dissertation about what was happening at Howard. And in that 3 paragraphs, I went down a rabbit hole of learning who was there. And so Howard in 1940 is the most extraordinary university in the United States, full stop, because of the amazing folks that were there. So one of the terrible and weird results of segregation is that these people were trained at all the very best schools who would not hire them. So you have leading people in all their fields who want to go to the Athens of black education. That's Howard. So everyone is there. Anyway, and so I start to do this work, and I discover that I start to read about Howard Thurmond and Benjamin Mays, and I'm enthralled. And I think about what my next book is going to be, and I keep on reading about their friendship. And I start by wanting to write a theological buddy book of Howard Thurmond and Benjamin Mays, and then I learned that they both met with Gandhi. And then it makes the engagement with the students at Howard and using Gandhian tactics all the stranger. So the long way of saying is one of the things that I realized is I know that there are connections between Gandhi and King, but I didn't know what they were. And now I know that there are these people who met with Gandhi and asked him really tough questions. And they taught a whole generation. So one of my contributions is I want to really recognize both one important part of where the movement comes from, but also underscore that this global movement has had repercussions that we don't. Okay, so I'm going to say one more thing and then I'll stop because I'm feeling like I'm speechifying. Okay, so that was an early part in the 1930s. You have, Bois and Thurmond are going to meet with Gandhi. Rustin is everywhere, and he's making friends with everybody because that's what he did. And one of the people he makes friends with is Tom Mboya, who was a Kenyan independence leader. And Tom Mboya was also a leader of the All-African Trade Union. And one of the things Mboya believes is that if he can get East African students trained in the United States, that will make a difference for East African independence movements. And so he is traveling the country in 1959 to raise money for what he wants there to be an airlift of hundreds of East African students who are come to the United States to go to college. And the title of the book, This Worldwide Struggle, comes from an introduction, that King gives to a Tom Mboya speech at an SCLC dinner in Atlanta in May 1959, when Mboya is in the United States fundraising, and King is standing there and says, to explain to you all here in Atlanta, what he is doing, we are all part of this worldwide struggle. He is trying to do in Kenya what we are trying to do here in Atlanta. And Mboya knew King because of Rustin. This has become all very important to all of us, whether we know it or not, because in August or September of that year, Mboya's protege is one of the 800 so-called airlift students, and it's Barack Obama, and he goes to the University of Hawaii to study. So I've just so been wishing for one of his post-presidential is to be engaging in this internationalism. We have benefited because of these relationships. Because Rustin knew Mboya, and Mboya is murdered, and after he's murdered, his children come to the United States and live with Rustin for a while. And they raise money here to support his family. So I don't know if that answers. Yeah. And this is pre-1965 Rustin. I don't know the post I do.
And organizing to do a march on Washington for pushing forward the integration of the schools. This was post 54, of course, and it was incredible to be involved in such the first march. I think when Rustin and King were on the monument grounds in D.C. and pushing for that to happen at mostly not integrated Swarthmore when I was a student. So this is all very real for me. And I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Good. No.
Other questions? Comments?
I'm Steve Angel, and it's good. I didn't know you were coming here to speak, but it's wonderful to hear this great presentation. So, you just mentioned the post-1965 Rustin, and maybe you don't want to get into that.
No, I'm there.
What that suggests to me is that there are different sorts of black internationalisms, that there aren't just people like the pre-1965 Rustin and Mays and Thurmond interacting with Gandhi, but the post-1965 Rustin is very concerned about getting Soviet Jewish dissidents out of Russia. So I'm just wondering, Soviet Union at the time, just wondering, if you've given thought into how to sort out these various black internationalisms that may in some way be at odds with one another from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think the book emerges out of sorting out that the people I was studying they weren't clearly Du Boisian, and they certainly weren't Garveyites, although they knew both well. And in fact, one of the people I write about, William Stewart Nelson, who was here in 1947, and on his way, he and his wife, to do a year of work in 1947 to 1948 in India. And they were there right until independence and partition. And they were working in villages that had been burned. And they were looking to create conditions of peace, doing conciliation work. I say all this to say that Nelson is very much part of this. One of the things the book does is to recognize, well, there's this other kind of Christian Black internationalism that doesn't fit. And I started to notice and see. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is map that, create that little pinpoint, create that taxonomy, because that's what we academics do. So here's the category. But also one of the things that's so I'm bringing up Nelson because Nelson, when he was a soldier in World War I, and he was stationed in France, and he was incredibly intellectually precocious, and when he's in France, he learns French. And then he decides to stay on and study at the Sorbonne in Paris, and then he goes to Berlin, and he learns German, and his diaries from both places, rudimentary, and so is mine, but I was reading his diary when he was in Germany, was in German, and his diary when he was in France was in French. And when he was in France in 1921, he was enlisted by Du Bois to serve as a translator at the Pan-African Conference there. And he, by all accounts, served as a really crucial, he and Rayford Logan, who is the historian best known for coining the phrase the nadir of American race relations, to talk about what happened after Reconstruction. Logan at the time was also a former soldier who was making money gambling. He was really good at poker, but he also spoke French, and they both served as translators for Du Bois. This is a very long way of saying he was part of that Du Boisian then too. He was completely connected, but he's also part of this other stream. Now, what do I make of their being divergent? I think that that's really important. It's really important to understand Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and his relationship with Nkrumah in 65, 67 is much different than Rustin's relationship with Nkrumah in 52, because Nkrumah himself has changed. So it's important to notice those changes. And so to answer specifically, so yes, so how do I notice that there's changes and that people change their mind, and Nkrumah especially. He's a Gandhian nonviolent pacifist in 1950. That's positive action. That's what frees Ghana. And then he advocates for armed revolutionary resistance. That's the same person. Both are true for him, right? Now, Rustin. I said post-1965 Rustin. I don't know. And I say I don't know because he's easily labeled and dismissed as a neocon. It's much more complicated. The very best account I've seen is D'Amelio's account. I think is the best of describing what's going on, right? Yeah. What I will say is to say, ask me again in 5 years, because one of the things that's motivating my next project is I started to notice I teach about Ella Baker, but I haven't written about her, and I love to teach about Rustin. I've loved writing about him. Is what they both have in common is their work in public school desegregation campaigns in New York City in the 50s and the 60s. And Rustin, it's right around this time that he turns kind of funny. So now I'm reading that, and I'm seeing if I can figure it out. I don't know what the answer is. Sorry. My book ends in 1959. That's why, no. Yeah, no. It's fine.
Thank you for your great presentation. It taught me a lot. I'm from India, and I don't know much about the civil rights movement, but I would like to make a comment about Mahatma Gandhi. Not that I knew him, but we learned a bit. As you said, that Gandhi went to South Africa after having graduated as a lawyer in England, and this was in 1890. So his first 20 years in South Africa was as a political leader, using the British legal system to fight for rights for the Indians, really, in South Africa. So I think it's a little bit unfair to call him a bit of a racist. He was working within his tools, his trainings, and fighting for rights within the British legal system. So his vision may have been very narrow or focused there, but when he went to India, he evolved. So we can't...
He warmed, is that what you said?
He evolved.
Oh, he evolved.
Well,
Oh,
yes.
okay, yeah.
So
Yeah.
to kind of keep him as a racist, I think might not be fair, because he was a young student. He was in his 20s when he went to South Africa.
He was.
He was.
He was. I think one of the things that, and you're right, and it's not that simple.
Right.
And if it were that simple, he wouldn't have made the great contributions he made to the 20th century. I think that question is a great question, though.
Yeah.
Who were you working with and why?
Yes.
I also think, I will say this from my experience of students, for example, at Union Theological Seminary, we've had a tradition of students from India, but and so I know this through the history, but I know this in my classroom. We have a number of students from India who are also Dalit students. And they, I don't want to speak for them. I will speak for my experience of having them in the classroom, and that is to talk about Gandhi in any way. There is a visceral reaction, which is that the extent that Gandhi defended caste for generations was keeping their families in poverty, and they have such problems. And this is one of the things. So when Maurice, you asked about Gandhi, one of the struggles in writing this book that I've had is that, for example, Mays disdained caste, Benjamin Mays, and he asked Gandhi, so it's wonderful that you want to undo so-called untouchability, but what about caste? And this was, so Gandhi he changed his mind about this too a little bit. And in 1936, Gandhi said to Mays, well, for the most part, I think it's a good thing that sons follow in the footsteps of their fathers. Well, Mays's father was a sharecropper. He didn't want to follow in his father's footsteps and basically racialized American peasantry. And he later that same trip, he has an experience of he's invited to an untouchable school. And actually, he hopes one of his colleagues is invited, who's also a Black American traveling. And the Dalit principal of the school sort of shakes, no, it has to be you. And Mays understands when he gets there, because Mays is dark-skinned, and his colleague was lighter-skinned. And the point, they introduce Mays, and they explain, see, he's an untouchable like you. He's an American. And Mays he cringes at that, and he says, well, no, I'm not. And then he realized, oh, no, but I am. Well, and just as an aside, King later told that story as happening to him. And maybe it did that exact same thing, but I've read through all that happened. But the sense of really taking your teacher's stories, right? And there's some truth in that. I'm saying all this to say that I really wish Mays, in his analysis of caste, would have learned so much from Ambedkar. And Annihilation of Caste came out in 1937, although it wasn't translated into English until I think a few years later.
But Ambedkar was a student of Gandhi, and he was a pretty prominent person
But he
Indian
was
independence
Gandhi's
movement.
greatest critic.
Yes. Well,
And-
later on. Yeah.
Well, in this period. But this point of I wish that
Yeah.
the people I'm writing about had more than Gandhi, because Gandhi is one person. And so when Mays also asked him this challenging question, Gandhi's challenge, Gandhi says, but people forget I'm just a man.
Yeah.
And so we have to remember that. And to respect that, and to respect that people make mistakes and are limited.
Most political and social leaders are just human beings.
Absolutely.
With feet of
Yeah.
clay. I mean,
Yeah.
I admire Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but he also had this
We all do.
little...
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
But that's important. I think that's what makes us able to take lessons from people whose moral visions are limited, because we don't pretend that they're saints or gurus. They're people.
That's right. But we focus on what they have to offer and what we learn from them.
Well, and I think we should also learn from places where they made mistakes. Absolutely. So we don't repeat the same things.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
I'll try. This is very heady stuff for me. I was struck by the question, why are you a Christian? Why aren't you a Muslim? And I'm struck by it in terms of we're all human beings, and why should the construction of our religion, of our heritage, determine what we feel and what we stand for? I'm a rabbi, and in Judaism, there's such diversity, and you see Judaism evolving over centuries upon centuries upon centuries, and you cannot imagine that out of the Hebrew Bible will come the Talmud, and you cannot imagine that modern Judaism will become what it becomes. And we have a concept in Judaism called midrash, where you take a text and the radical interpretations that come out of it, where do they come from? Right. God is speaking to you? How? How is God speaking to you? So that's where we are. We're asking, King asked questions, what should I do? How should I have a civil rights struggle? And you could see him changing over time. And so I don't want to put it on Christianity, the burden on Christianity, or the burden on a particular right way of doing things, but I would like to see us just struggle with the fact that this is hard stuff, and we're all human beings.
Yes, I think Gandhi's question, he knew the hundreds of years of history of Christianity enabling empire. And he knew in the United States that, as King would later say, the most segregated hour, and it remains so, and that churches, Sunday morning, and that, thank you, sorry, I thought it was like a truism, and that churches, and that this newspaper report that a student sends back, that people left church to go lynch somebody, and then they came back to church. So that, and so this is where, like, in response to this, Thurmond, I think, does what you are advocating, which is this distinction between the religion of Jesus and Christianity. As much as Thurmond spends the rest of his life trying to create institutions within Christianity that are, in fact, profoundly integrated and interracial, I want to, because I can't help but be a little bit historically arcane, I want to say that this question about why wasn't he Muslim, this would have been profoundly intelligible to him as a Black American, because there was a history going back as long as there had been, Black Muslims have been here since since Black people had been brought to this country, but also that people converting to Islam who were not otherwise Muslim Black Americans, there was a tradition of that in part out of frustration with Christianity's racism. So this question, he would know. Yeah.
Have you read this book, America's Original Sin? It's by, what's his name, Willis? He's a theological writer, and who's very much interested in, and it's quite an interesting book written by a white theologian about racism in America and the Christian role in it, and the role that Christian churches could now be playing to open up
to change. Yeah.
a new path to reconciliation and so on. Here. It's an interesting take on this kind of issue.
Age-old problem.
Yeah. That's from the first one dragged on shore while taking stuff away from the Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
If there are no more questions, let's thank you, Sarah, again.
Oh, my pleasure.
And just to invite everyone, there will be a book signing out in the foyer. I'll let Sarah escape to go do that. And if folks could please clear out of this space to continue asking any questions of Sarah or discussing the talk amongst yourselves. That way we can reset the room for tomorrow morning's worship. So thank you again. Thank you again to everyone who came, and the video will be up on Pendle Hill